Hello there, welcome back to Conversations in Sustainability, a podcast exploring the biggest issues shaping Australia and the world.
When we think about producers working to reduce emissions on the road to net zero, TV producers aren't exactly the first people to spring to mind. So when we learned that Australia's esteemed special broadcasting service, and you know it as SBS, had become the first Australian broadcaster to have achieved net zero on its direct emissions, with further ambitious targets for 2045, we wanted to know more. Angela Burgess is integral to this mission. An experienced production and business management executive, she's managed everything from low-budget projects to large-scale multi-platform productions for production companies and broadcasters here and in the UK. Now, as Head of Production Finance at SBS, Angela works with the network's Head of Sustainability, Abigail Thomas, to help make SBS an industry leader in sustainability. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello. Angela, tell us about your role at SBS and how sustainability increasingly factors into your work.
So yes, as you said, Head of Production Finance, which covers many different things, but the thing that keeps me the most busy is looking after our commissioned and in-house productions. So we have many different types of show at SBS. Some of them we are engaging with production partners to commission them to go and make shows. Sometimes we're producing them in-house, such as the cook-up in our studios. So we've got many different types of production going on, and my role is to essentially make sure that the money, the practice, the risk is all managed within those productions effectively for the company. And what has fallen under that remit recently is how sustainable a production is. So when we're looking at budgets, which we do thoroughly for any type of production, whether it's an internal or an external, what we're starting to do now is try to figure out a way of understanding what kind of emissions a production would also have. We're not doing this at the beginning of production at this point. I am hearing that that's happening in the UK, which is really interesting. But for us at the moment, it's very much about understanding what emissions our productions are actually responsible for. What we have found in Australia is we're very much reliant on data from international. So when we talk about the average carbon emission of a show per hour, it's very much based on data from the UK or from other territories. So what we're really trying to do now is get a baseline, understand what it is we're actually responsible for, and then we'll get a really good understanding of where we could be changing that and we'd be reducing our carbon.
Okay. Well, before we get into breaking down, how programs are measured, just want to zoom out a little bit. What's the bigger picture that's influencing SBS's work on sustainability and creating low emissions shows?
Absolutely. So we're a purpose-driven organisation. We see it as our responsibility to do all we can do to contribute to the reduction of our emissions into the planet. And, we want to do what we can to put our best foot forward in what we can control. And what we can control is within SBS, it's putting a message out there. It's making sure that we are getting our own house in order.
Mm-hmm. So presumably, it's not just about altruistic ideas of improving the planet. There is an economic imperative increasingly in having low emissions product.
Of course. So we have advertisers interested in what our plan is. They absolutely want to know where we sit in all of this, what kind of strategies we're putting in place. It's becoming more and more important to people to understand what suppliers they're using and what their, emissions are and what their net zero plans are. And so it's circular. So we're asking the question and we're being asked the question of. So yeah, it's really important.
Okay, so SBS is the first Australian broadcaster to reach net zero on direct emissions. That's Scope 1 and 2. Congratulations. Your last year, I believe. Next up is Scope 3, which is the subject of the 2045 target. And Scope 3 is all about supply chains. So 2045 is a way off. Presumably that's because it's a pretty monumental task.
Absolutely, yeah. So Scope 3 encompasses emissions that are not produced by the company itself. So this is our suppliers. This is people that we work with who we have very little control over what their company policy might be, what they're doing internally. And so that is, that's the biggest challenge. So we're saying 2045 because we think that we can have influence in those spaces and we can work to get to that point. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take the world moving along with us to get there. So that's why the 2045 target. So so we're looking at things like our acquisitions. We're, overwhelmingly an acquisitions network. We acquire shows from all over the world. We also, produce shows with external partners. We have our advertisers, and then obviously, the list goes on. So in order to reach net zero by 2045, we have to have all of these people going along with the ride with us.
Well, let's talk about some of the shows so we can sort of get a practical example.
Absolutely.
SBS is also the first, there's a lot of firsts at SBS, the first Australian TV network to begin carbon measurement on individual shows. And in SBS's case, that includes Insight, The Cook Up with Adam Liao, and Going Places with Ernie Dingo. They're three quite different shows, one involving travel and the other is studio-based. So what sort of factors do you look at in carbon measurement of those programs? Can you take us through the options available to make them more climate-friendly?
Absolutely. So we're using a tool that we have licensed through Sustainable Screens Australia, which is a tool that the UK have been using for over a decade. So it's called the Albert Calculator. And it's an online calculator, and what you do is you enter in all of your emissions through looking at it at the lens through your budget. So you're looking at your travel and transport, you're looking at your energy for your studio or your batteries or whatever it is that your show is set up to film. So for Ernie, you're out with reusable batteries, but you're charging them overnight in a hotel somewhere. For the Cook Up, all studio based. So it can be very different. But you're also measuring things like catering. It's amazing how big of a dial you can, how far the dial can move when you do a meat-free day on a catering day.
Really?
On a studio production. Or you're also looking at crew. You're also looking at host costumes. So anything that is purchased for the show. So if, for example, you're reusing costumes or you're hiring costume or wardrobe, then the emissions are practically zero based in comparison to purchasing new for that particular series.
So if Ernie's wearing a new jacket, then you have to trace it.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
No wonder it's going to be 2045.
Yes.
So presumably to reach that 2045 target, you'll need to factor in all content, not just your lovely homegrown material, but programs bought from overseas. So how do you do that? I mean, is a Fellini movie, zero emissions compared with a celebrity travel program that involves lots of air miles, etc.?
It's a real learning process with this one, because a lot of our content is from overseas. A lot of our content is licensed in many territories. So the original footprint that production emitted has been counted, and we have no control over that. And then it has been sold into many territories. So we are looking at the best way that we can understand what those emissions are. So Abby and I spent a lot of time on evening phone calls to many other territories, Canada, the UK, lots in Europe, to talk about what companies are doing in their scope, so where they're at and where their measurements are where their targets lie. And then a lot of them are actually using the Albert calculator as well. So some of them have shared the data with us of what the emissions of particular shows that we've purchased are, for example. So, something like a travel show will have high emissions, but we need to grapple with the idea that it's not just SBS that have actually purchased that, and we've purchased that for a much lower cost of the actual show was made. So that is something that Abby and I are dealing with at the moment, of how best to represent it. And it's also something we've been speaking to other broadcasters about how they're doing it, and it very much is a learning process at the moment. But what's been amazing is just how much of a sharing space this has been, and how everybody has been so willing to give their time. And, you know, there's no competition in this. We're all trying our best to do the right thing for the planet. So what's been really great is even areas where you could have considered our competitors, we're absolutely in this space together, and there's lots of sharing of knowledge. So to your question, yes, there will be a vast difference between, you know, a 5-hour drama, Handmaid's Tale, versus a documentary that's filmed in someone's backyard. That will be huge. And a lot of the times they're using the same methods that we are in how to measure it. So we're getting a lot of that data through from our distributors and from our production partners.
What sort of pressure will these sort of targets and imperatives put on production and programming? I'm thinking from a consumer point of view. Will we start seeing different things, see a narrower range of product?
Look, I don't think so. I think a lot of the where we're coming from is we want the industry to thrive. We're not coming from a place because you know, I think me and my colleague were talking about this the other day. You know, the easy calculation is to go, well, then do less because your emissions will be less. But I think that's a lazy answer, and I don't think that's the answer that anybody wants. So I think it's about we are hypothesizing of what that could look like. We're wondering whether we will be looking at. I think, to be honest, what we really need is to understand. We really want to understand what it is, and then can we be more aware, like things like the catering, like the things that you don't see on screen, the things that aren't going to influence the viewer's enjoyment or the editorial. And then I think it's about using the editorial empowerment as well. So it's making sure that we're mirroring the real life on screen. So we're hearing anecdotes out of the UK again of dramas that are just ensuring that sustainability is woven through their editorial without real kind of comment or, you know, too overt for the viewer. But, you know, there's a vegan character and they're having a vegan dinner. Nobody needs to comment on that. It just is, because it's a reflection of the real life. And so we have conversations about that. And I think SBS naturally does that with a lot of our content anyway. We recently had Great Australian Walks, and we had Gina Chick do a walk day in Tasmania. And, you know, we hadn't noted that was going to be anything specifically sustainably based editorial. However, you can't be in a rainforest talking about the beautiful wildlife and the birds without considering what's happening to the planet. And so naturally through the editorial that kind of came out. So I think there's two prongs. There's understanding our data, there's what does this look like, what can we do about it without impacting the audience, and then there's also reflecting what's really happening in the world.
Okay. What's the standard like in the TV production industry? You know, I'm talking about your immediate competitors. Are many other organisations thinking and acting on this?
Absolutely. So when we meet as Sustainable Screens Australia members, most of the, if not all of the networks are on there, so that everybody is playing their part. I think ABC are, you know, we like to have all of these. We're the first at this and we're the first at that. But I think ABC are very close behind us. I think the reason we're first is because we are extremely passionate. I'm not saying they're not, but we're much smaller. We're very agile. And so I think we've gone in and we've gone, let's make this happen. And I think everybody else is doing the same. So, you know, on those forums, I know that Charles Hen are quite advanced in this space. Netflix certainly leaps and bounds, I think. And I could name them all, but I'm sure I'd miss somebody out and I'd be wrong. But, you know, everybody's leaning in. And actually what's been really great for us is we have a whole heap of shows that we haven't had to ask people to do the Albert calculator, because there are companies that maybe have an international base, or like us, they just jumped on this and really wanted to do it. So we have, I'd say, probably about a 50-50 split of shows that we commission who just come along with an Albert calculator anyway, because that's just part of doing business with them now, which is fabulous. And then we have others who are perhaps smaller production companies, a bit less resources. And when we say, hey, this is something we'd love you to look at, actually so far, 100% of the time people have gone, absolutely, show us what it is. We want to be involved. Of course we want to do this. So the space feels like it's really growing, and I do think it'll be business as usual very, very soon.
Mm-hmm. Is the Albert calculator time consuming to apply to?
It can be. It can be depending on how complex your production is. So you can set up the initial what you think your carbon emissions will be at the beginning of a production quite quickly. That's a process that takes probably as long as building a budget, if not less. But the time-consuming part of it is, from start to finish of your production, is updating it with the actuals all the way through. So I think it's one of the things that Albert and Sustainable Screens really encourages: start early, make sure you know what you're tracking, because it's very hard to go back and try to retrofit this. You have to go through the process of the production. So it can be time-consuming, but people are coming up with some incredible methods and very clever ways of tracking things. I've heard producers talk about QR codes for tracking kilometres in production vehicles, and there's all sorts of different ways that people are shortcutting the tracking of things. But it's like anything else. It's like tracking, I guess, your costs. It's going to be a similar process.
Well, it sounds like the future is going to be a whole lot more streamlined for people in jobs like yours.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Angela. And congratulations on being in the network with so many Australian firsts in sustainability.
Thank you very much.
Talk to you another time. Thanks.